If you haven't watched the previous few fitness vlogs, I've been executing a strength block of 5-3-1 in order to increase my 1 rep max, and today is that week of ones, also known as singles. If you're someone who's struggling with lower back pain and injuries during conventional deadlifts, I suggest that you try sumo deadlifts. The biggest key difference is in the spinal erectors, aka erector spinae. A study from 1988 by Thelma S. Horn claims that the conventional deadlift has double the activation of the spinal erectors versus the sumo, but I've not been able to locate this original study. Camila et al. In 2002 found that while the hamstrings and glutes were equally active, the quads had a lot more activation during sumo versus conventional. And if we examine the data, while the rectus femoris activity is similar between the two, the vastus lateralis and the medialis, which are the inner and outer heads of the quads, are far more active in the sumo deadlift. And the biggest surprise from this study was that the hamstring activity was greater during the sumo deadlift. And even the glutes were more active, according to this data. The sumo deadlift had greater muscle activation of the quads, hamstrings, and glutes. But this was only one study, and there were very few EMG studies on the deadlift variations, so more research should be done, but this is not what I was expecting to see when I did the research. A study by Cholowicki et al. In 1991 showed that the sumo exerts almost 10% less shear force on the vertebrae, which gives it that advantage over conventional deadlift. Obviously, the spine is going to experience shear force in both variations, and you shouldn't be afraid of loading your spine and stretching it to its limits and loading it at its extremes. But trying to max out your spinal flexion to see just how much force it can withstand is not the best approach. You're gonna have a bad time. While the conventional deadlift is also good if you're someone who has back issues, or you're a beginner that lacks the mind-muscle connection of an advanced lifter, the sumo might be the best option for you. After a few warm-up sets, working up to 4 or 5, I went into my heavy working sets, which were 455 and 465 for a total of 4 sets of 1. This is a weight that I've never tried before in my entire life, and I've only ever touched 445, so the progress has been insane. I focused on this lift, stayed consistent, and haven't neglected mobility and stretching, and we're very close to hitting 5 plates on the deadlift, which will be the attempt next week. As always, my back days consist of pull-ups. What squats do for the legs, the pull-ups do for the back. They are guaranteed to produce results if you do them long enough. So do as many as you can. If you can't do one, do a slow negative, which means starting from the top and descending as slowly as humanly possible. Included in today's workout was one exercise for the triceps, done at a high intensity but a higher rep range. The rep scheme was 4 sets of 12 pyramid, which means 12, 10, 8, 6, increasing the weight every set. Make sure that you emphasize the contraction or the squeeze at the bottom. It's something that people forget to do, and you miss out on that 20% of the rep, which helps recruit more muscle fibers. After this tricep push down with the ropes, I went into some one-arm dumbbell rows. The biggest difference between the supported version, which is where you have the knee on a bench, versus the unsupported version, which is what I'm doing here, is the amount of core activation and stabilization required. When you're first starting out on your fitness journey, the knee on bench is a perfect option for you, but once you've learned how to properly row by pulling the elbow to the hip and contracting the lats, the unsupported variation will allow you to go a little bit heavier. It will increase the range of motion in the stretched position, and you will activate your core, glutes, and hamstring muscles, which carry over to other aspects. One of my biggest mistakes during this exercise is that my reps were way too fast. I should have slowed down the negative portion and spent a lot more time emphasizing the contraction. If I were coaching myself, I would not be happy with these sets if my goal was hypertrophy. As we transition into the end of the workout, I did 2 bicep exercises and 2 hamstring/glute exercises. This is called a dumbbell concentration curl, and it's an old school isolation movement for the biceps that's proven year after year. If the guys in the 70s did them and saw results, then it's a good bet that it still works today. There's many things about weight training, bodybuilding, and the art of building muscle that is simple and basic, but works, and it's worked for decades and decades. You don't have to overcomplicate things and become obsessive about granular details. As long as you execute the basics, you're setting yourself up for success. Seated dumbbell bicep curls still work if you do them properly, if you execute proper form and go heavy enough. At the end of my workout, I finished off with 2 hamstring and glute exercises. This one is called a banded pull through, and it's absolutely phenomenal for targeting the glutes, especially at the contracted position. And I love doing it with a band because it gets harder as you move through the movement. Then finally, I finish off with some seated hamstring curls. Surprisingly, according to the research, the seated leg curl is superior to the lying leg curl because when you're seated, the hips have greater flexion, meaning that in a seated position, the hamstrings are lengthened more. If a muscle fiber is longer at the starting position, that means that it has a capacity for a longer range of motion, and a longer range of motion means that more muscle fibers are being recruited to execute the repetition. And if you've made it this far, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe.